want to start? Well, thank you again to everyone for joining this event today, focusing on Mission 2024 and what needs to happen this year to build consensus, to drive change and deliver action, reducing emissions and our pathway to net zero. The Mission Zero Coalition was formed 10 months ago at the time of the government's official response to the net zero review, the ambition of driving forward the recommendations in the Mission Zero report, producing several reports for each of the 10 missions outlined in the review. Last year, the Coalition published 4 reports, including the Future is Local, chaired by Lord Ben Houchen, the Tees Valley Mayor, Mission Retrofit, chaired by Simon McWhirter, the Deputy CEO of the UK Green Buildings Council, and Decarbonise Now, the report of the Industrial Mission Zero Network, of which Aveva is a member. And I'm really grateful to Aveva and Sophie today for their kind hosting of this event in their London offices. The Coalition has also sought to widen its impact from UK policy to focus also on international climate policy, publishing a history of the COP process, and held its first event at COP 28 in the Innovation Zone, focusing on the work of the Mission Zero Breakthrough Buildings Network and the Global Buildings Breakthrough. I'm delighted to announce that in a few weeks' time, the Coalition will be publishing its 5th report, Building the Future, that highlights the importance of UK leadership on the design and development of new net zero buildings as part of the work of our buildings network that includes leading practitioners who are pioneering low emissions buildings, such as Amazon, AW Homes, Barratt's, Grosvenor and Landsac. Building the Future will contain lessons for the Buildings Breakthrough. I'll be travelling to Paris in early March to attend the Buildings Breakthrough conference organised by the French government. The Coalition has also begun its work on a new report, the Mission Zero Power Generation Report, that encompasses the 4 missions in the Net Zero Review, including grid and infrastructure, solar, wind and nuclear, with the intention of publishing a final report at London Climate Action Week. And as I said earlier, I'm delighted to be joined by Dan McGrail, CEO of Renewable UK, who will be participating in a question and answer session with me later. Dan has also kindly agreed to co-chair the Power Generation Report, and I'm greatly looking forward to working with him on what is an essential task for 2024, outlining the detail that is needed to meet the respective commitments, yet to absolutely see what those commitments will involve, of political parties to deliver a net zero grid, whether in 2030 or 2035. Already, the Net Zero Review highlighted the opportunity and potential that renewable and clean power, combined with a more flexible grid system, can deliver for households, with cheaper bills, more reliable sources of energy, and the chance to become active participants in their future energy use and savings, if only the barriers and delays that are preventing the adoption of such an energy system were removed. This year, as all political parties prepare to set out their plans for the next 5 years if elected, it is a moment that must be seized, both to set out the costs, but also the benefits that the energy transition can deliver for the future. And 2024 has the potential to be one of the most important years facing any policymaker or politician dedicated to making the energy transition happen. In the UK, we've not only got the general election later this year, whenever that may come, but in less than 90 days, voters across the country will be going to the polls on the 2nd of May to elect both their local councillors and, in many regions, their mayor. For myself and anyone committed to net zero delivery, the next few weeks are a critical time. It will be the mayors who are at the helm of making the UK's climate ambitions a reality. Across the world, it's actually, in fact, our cities that are leading the charge towards decarbonisation. They're the ones that are shifting the dial. And in the UK, mayors such as Sadiq Khan in London, who chairs the C40, or Andy Street in the West Midlands, have made clear their own personal commitments to the energy transition, recognising that it's an opportunity and not a cost that can provide residents with warmer homes, less pollution on our streets, and ultimately deliver regional growth and regeneration, attracting inward investment worth hundreds of millions of pounds, just as Bristol Mayor Marvin Rees has done with the pioneering Bristol City Leap. For other mayors, such as Ben Houchen in Tees Valley, net zero has actually become a central part of their vision for their own regions, a chance to bring manufacturing back to industrial areas long left behind. Now, it no longer matters to me personally what political colour these mayors stand behind. As I stated in my resignation letter, I will now work with anyone and any party that is serious about delivering and implementing net zero commitments and the energy transition on the ground. And I'm pleased to announce that the West Yorkshire Mayor, Tracy Braving, will now in fact be co-chairing Mission Zero Coalition with me, demonstrating our mutual cross-party commitment that we shouldn't play politics with action on climate. Whereas once myself and Tracy sat on the opposite benches in the House of Commons, today we stand together united that net zero and climate action is too important to seek to divide and play political games. And anyone who is serious about making the UK economy stronger, anyone who's serious about creating and protecting jobs and communities, knows that there is no alternative. We have to do this, and the energy transition is here to stay. And regardless of what takes place at Westminster or Whitehall, I've been deeply impressed by how our mayors of all parties are serious about delivering the benefits of the transition for their region. I will be joining Tracy and other mayors at the Convention of the North in Leeds in early March, making again the case for why net zero is a positive force for change, a change that will benefit communities if the right investment and commitment is made across the country. It's a message that I sought to demonstrate in the Net Zero Review Mission Zero, that actually when you get out of Westminster, when you get around the country and you meet businesses and you meet industries who trade globally or who operate with international supply chains, there is a willingness and a desire to move further, faster. They know that to delay the energy transition, to delay measures that will need to be taken to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions will only cost them more, and ultimately it may cost them their business. Not zero, or to ignore the imperative right now across the world that decisions are being taken in boardrooms about where to place international investment. If the UK does not step up or turns its face against net zero opportunities, this would be an economic disaster for the UK. That's why, in advance of these 2nd of May elections, while I may have stepped down from the House of Commons, I'm now stepping up my focus, demonstrating why and how net zero is the opportunity of our generation to deliver inward investment, as the Net Zero Review calculated, of up to £1 trillion, to create nearly 500,000 new additional jobs and to future-proof our economy for the future. I'll be getting around the country, visiting the regions where those mayoral elections are taking place, and will share a platform with any mayor or candidate to highlight the chance that net zero can bring to their region and a chance that that investment may not come again. It's a vision I know that many mayors share for their regions, but the task for 2024, ahead of the national general election, is also to weave these stories of success from businesses, from community energy groups, into a narrative, a national reality of net zero and our journey towards clean and renewable energy, our pathway towards warm and better homes, and a drive towards cleaner forms of transport is actually delivering today for the UK. But ultimately, this must be about hope. Elections are won by political parties setting out what they stand for, not by those parties that simply shout what they're against. Elections are won by the party that voters will believe will deliver a vision of hope, how life in Britain can be improved and made better by those who are not simply content with the status quo. And in my mind, there is no better opportunity for all political parties to demonstrate hope for a better Britain than embracing the benefits that net zero can bring. The chance to restore nature and conserve local environments, the chance to deliver, as I've said, investment, jobs, growth, to establish new trading partnerships and export opportunities, to get spades in the ground and to regenerate, restore, and empower local communities to take those decisions over how they wish to produce their own homegrown energy. It's a narrative that I sought to begin to weave in the Mission Zero report, but to be honest, there is still so much more work that needs to be done to finish the task. In contrast to the siren calls of disinformation and dishonesty that seek to destabilize climate action for ideological purposes, which are growing ever more prevalent, 2024 must be a year in which, regardless of our mainstream political differences, those who are serious about the future of the UK and who want to provide that hope and reassurance that the future can be better than the present, and certainly better than the past, must step up to deliver their messages in ways that can clearly communicate and clearly cut through. So Labour's plan for a green mission, the Green Prosperity Plan, for instance, has been trapped in what I believe to be a sterile and irrelevant media debate over a £28 billion figure. It doesn't seem to matter that actually the current administration, if you add up all the various spending commitments, which no one seems to have actually done, went from £11 billion on offshore wind announced at COP28 to £20 billion over CCUS over 20 years, multiple billions of pounds on nuclear to an additional £6 billion a year on a Great British Insulation Scheme. You're pretty much getting close to a similar amount of spending eventually over time. And regardless of this, no one has ever said who works in climate policy that net zero and the energy transition is going to be delivered solely by the taxpayer. Across the country, net zero provides a remarkable moment for also private investment, often with a multiple of several pounds, sometimes into double figures, matching way beyond every public pound spent. And actually, I look back to 2019 when I was in government as the UK's science minister. And in the run-up to the 2019 general election, I secured the largest uplift in public R&D spending in UK history, from £12 billion a year to what was a commitment back in 2019 of £24 billion by 2025. Actually, it went down after the election to £22 billion. And actually, that commitment now seems to have been silently dropped without any media coverage. So I think we need to have in context here a reality of what the announcement today by Labour is, with actually what happens in government quite regularly. But the ultimate challenge, I think, is that there was no doubt back in 2019 or division between parties that this was not the right thing to do if the UK wanted to actually face the future. And so it should be for a green mission also. But I've talked about the £28 billion being a sterile debate because what should matter is the outcome of how a long-term programmatic mission-based approach can in turn reduce costs by creating economies of scale, greater efficiencies and productivity, especially if delivered through a place-based, regionally focused plan that also involves mayors and local authorities. The certainty of a long-term commitment by government moving beyond the spending review period is exactly what the Net Zero Review called for to deliver the confidence that investors, business and industry all need there to back the UK. But what we also need is the detail. For delivery will be in the detail to highlight how net zero is and can continue to deliver on the ground. The Mission Zero report, and indeed the Mission Zero Coalition, in its reports and its future reports, has sought to highlight what success can look like, how delivery can be improved. We have that detailed long-term plan. And with a plan, can also bring long-term international leadership and economic success. So just as the UK led as the first G7 country to sign net zero into law, just as we led at COP26 with the most ambitious national determined contribution, so the UK can lead with a delivery plan of how to achieve net zero that other countries can seek to emulate. When it comes to Mission 2024, however, the UK is just one of many countries to be holding its national elections. Pakistan goes to the polls today, one of 60 countries in which national elections will be held. In around 20 of these, making up a third of global emissions, the issue of climate action and the need to reduce emissions is a contested political one. It is likely that elections both in the US and Germany and in wider EU elections, that climate policies will become increasingly polarized, especially by populist parties that seek to stoke fear, insecurity, and anger. More than ever, if climate action is to succeed, it cannot merely go quiet at this moment in history, hoping to pass under the radar. This is not a time for green hushing, when we need to be loudly proclaiming not just what needs to happen, but why and how net zero is the opportunity for growth, for a new economy, and that the energy transition is happening regardless. And to turn back or to go slow or to delay will only cost more, will add billions to the bills of those trapped on volatile fossil fuels, will cost jobs and growth that could have been ours. It's why it's so important that in the UK, we have a mature debate based on truth and not falsehoods, on evidence and not slurs, that demonstrates consensus can ultimately be found. It's a month ago to the day since I resigned in protest at new oil and gas licenses. I did so not merely because countless organisations, from the Committee on Climate Change to the UNCCC to the International Energy Authority, have all stated very clearly on record that new additional oil and gas is incompatible with climate commitments, but also because there will be no future economic case for new additional oil and gas very shortly. To issue new licenses and to commission new oil fields at a time when our demand for fossil fuels is about to plummet is to create stranded assets, stranded communities, and ultimately stranded jobs that will soon cease to exist. At a time when we should be investing in the industries of the future, we cannot afford to be subsidising the industries of the past. And above all, the case against new oil and gas is not merely because it is a climate disaster, it's also an economic disaster in the making. But to place false hope in oil and gas is just one failure in a wider lack of vision and hope for the future. When it comes to delivering the energy transition and net zero, also to row back, to delay, to go slow, is to sleepwalk further into economic disaster and decline and stagnation. We are not only in a race against time to deliver on our emissions reduction, we're in a net zero race with other countries seeking to attract the investment that I said could be ours. That boardroom I mentioned earlier, where investment decisions are being made today, might be pausing its investment, awaiting the outcome of certain elections. But ultimately, those decisions will be made on the basis of which country provides the greatest certainty and the least risk. Let's ensure that the UK is the country of choice, rather than allowing that investment to go elsewhere, by creating the investable and overwhelming case that why we can be trusted to help lead the energy transition with all the benefits that it can bring to industry. We can do better, and the country deserves better. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening to that speech. We're now going to sort of turn to a bit of a conversation with myself and Dan. So I'm going to come and sit down here, give Dan the opportunity to introduce himself. And then once we've had a bit of a chat, we'll go to questions from the audience and questions from you also online. So Dan, thanks for joining me, and thank you for all the work you've been doing. Obviously, 2024 is a key year, an election year. All parties are seeking to eventually set out their commitments in their manifestos, whatever they might come. What for you as one of the key voices in the renewable sector are the opportunities that you see as being absolutely vital for 2024?
Well, thank you, Chris. Firstly, just to introduce myself, yeah, Dan McGrail. I'm the Chief Executive of Renewable UK. Renewable UK is a trade body that, well, we think the largest net zero carbon trade association in the UK. We represent about just under 500 companies who are all driving the delivery of net zero infrastructure in the country. And it comes to opportunities. I mean, I think you said one thing in your speech, Chris, which I think is really important about that this is happening, that there's an inevitability about this. And I tend to think of the energy transition in kind of three tranches. The first is at the small, modular, localized, scalable products like solar, rooftop solar, EVs, etc., which are, 80% of research and development money in the automotive industry is being spent on electrification. So, and hardly anything on internal combustion. So that tells you that electrification of the automotive sector is happening, and that is an irrevocable change. So that plays few, 40% of our primary energy goes to transport in the UK. So there is real confidence we can take at a global level that this is happening. But in the world of infrastructure, the challenges are different, I think, and that's the second tranche. I think maybe come back to that. And then there's the third tranche that I tend to think of, which is the digitally enabled services that connect those two things together, the small scale, local, domestic business, and how they react as consumers within a world where the infrastructure is more variable, the supply of electricity is subject to other things. But that really comes then into the opportunity of what is the big opportunity. And, again, you touched on it in your speech around reindustrialization, this place-based economic growth, which I think is hugely exciting. I represent, mainly wind energy within my day-to-day work. And if I just look at offshore wind alone, we expect to create about 100,000 jobs in the sector. It's a little bit more actually by 2030. And that is it's just an enormous opportunity. We're about 30,000 today. So just in one segment of the energy transition, then we're looking at reaching investment levels which are comparable with the oil and gas boom in the 1980s. 17, 20 billion pounds sustained every year, spread across the country in various different hotspots. So that creates that opportunity for place-based sort of regeneration, growth, high-value jobs, which really, can define the future. And I think tapping into that hopeful vision is really key in 2024, which sort of perhaps brings me to some of the headwinds and some of the challenges, because, it's really important we keep that sense of purpose and hope within our day-to-day work, because there are some big reforms that we have to make to deliver this infrastructure. Notably, we really need to build a huge transformation of the national grid infrastructure and networks in general, and this will meet opposition along the way, and it will have consequences. So we have to sort of be able to keep that hopeful vision in mind whilst we overcome some of those challenges. And that's why the political consensus that you referred to earlier is also really important to make sure that there aren't people exploiting dividing lines for political gain, when actually the overarching mission is economic growth, national renewal in the face of combating climate change. So that is for me, a hopeful environment in which to do business. It's a positive environment in which to do business. The final point I just make in terms of 2024 on renewables in particular is this should be, by rights, the biggest year in the history of renewable energy for the UK. We should unlock probably over £30 billion of investment in wind alone if we get auction designs right, if we get the policy frameworks right, and the wheels have been put in motion for that to happen, but delivery and some key decisions along the way during 2024 to make that happen. There's an opportunity for a big bang here in terms of real economic growth.
And you've mentioned, obviously, there's a sort of slight twin track approach in that we've got the election, we've got a lot of rhetoric on either side, pro or against renewables. But then behind the scenes, work ongoing to unblock some of the barriers. Obviously, we had the Windsor Review. We've got the spatial plan. I think the Prime Minister announced in his Net Zero Roadmap speech, which was obviously one of the good things in the speech. What do you see as being absolutely key, regardless of all the political manoeuvring that's going to be taking place, that needs to be delivered in 2024 for you to sort of move forward with that economic opportunity?
I mean, you mentioned the Windsor Review, and I think it's almost worth having a light-hearted moment to think, we've got the Prime Minister and the Chancellor talking about grid, around, that doesn't happen normally. It's not typically a conversation starter in the club or something that drives people out to vote. But it's so important that we have this high on the agenda, and that's actually a pretty good thing, that understanding the importance of unlocking investments in grid. This is a long-term national renewal, a major infrastructure project which will last, at least 2 decades. So starting the ball rolling on that investment program 2024 is absolutely key. And there are good things happening, actually. Behind the scenes, since the Prime Minister's speech, there are, institutions being set up. We've seen the announcements of the National Electricity System Operators, formal announcement of that. The Energy Bill turned into the Energy Act, the Levelling Up Bill turned into the Levelling Up Act. And these have crucial pieces of reform. For example, making renewable energy assets, in particular offshore wind, considered to be, in critical national infrastructure. Now, that wasn't the case in the past, and that gives a really important signal to planning bodies, for example. And then the infrastructure associated with that, such as the grid, needs to follow suit in terms of being seen as critically nationally important. But also in all of that, it's vital that we bring communities along with us, because those are, those are really important pieces of infrastructure that we get going. I mean, I would say behind the scenes since 2021, and probably since the invasion of the Ukraine, there has been a very significant amount of policy action, which hasn't been happening in the headlines. It's been happening, in Whitehall, driving sort of important changes, and that is, setting the ball in motion. But there is clearly, as you allude to, an awful lot more to do to really get the scale up now and really start to see the investment flow.
And in terms of the challenge today, see Labour's potential announcement, whatever you'd like to call it, on the Green Prosperity Plan and the exact amount of money they're going to spend on that. And as I've said in my speech, that's not the issue for me. It's sort of a long-term mission-based sort of commitment, and the numbers will flow from having the outcomes and a price tag attached to some of those outcomes. What's your own sort of view as one of the voices of the renewable sector around this? Because I don't want to fall into, a false trap around just thinking about the figure. But what's the consequences, I think, for you making sure you get that sort of commitment for all parties on renewables?
I think the first thing to say is that Labour have been very strong and ambitious regarding their ambitions for net zero power system by 2030. It's incredibly strong, ambitious, and the challenges to deliver that are huge. But that mission is one of clear, crystal direction, which is helpful for industry. It's always disappointing when people row back from a commitment. But what I'd say as a having sat in those boardrooms that you refer to is look, I'd much rather they make the change now than than come into government and then change it afterwards. And we've seen, like, for example, changes in policy on a decade ago, big plans for carbon capture and storage, which people were investing and spending money and committing people's time and resource and efforts to, which were then pulled at last minute. And that's way more unhelpful than doing it at this stage. But what is really important to understand, and actually, again, as you said in your speech, you're absolutely right, is that it was always going to be private capital which is going to do the heavy lifting in the energy transition. We need $4.5 trillion according to the IEA for investment in energy per annum by 2030. That is always going to come overwhelmingly from private capital. The growth rates in the installation of wind, I mean, we got to, in wind installations, we got to a terawatt globally of wind installations in 2023. It took us, 30, 40 years to get to? We'll get to the second terawatt in 7 years. So the underlying fundamental growth in this sector is huge, and it's driven by innovation, enterprise, and private capital. And yes, there is a role, an important role for public sector capital, and that that will always be the case in any industry, as we see even now in mature industries like aviation, for example, where we still see activist engagement from the public sector. But it has to be done in tandem. And for me now, the question, and this isn't just a question of Labour, it's a question of all political parties, is how do you work on your policy environment to stimulate the maximum amount of private capital investment into the industry as possible? We've shown we can do that with things like the contract for difference in Britain over the last decade, and finding more, involving those mechanisms to do more of that is possible, deliverable, and absolutely we're all for working together with governments, whoever that is, to make it happen.
And you've mentioned a couple of global statistics, global trends. How important is that we don't just have this insular sort of UK debate over borrowing, spending, but actually we need to look in that wider context about what's happening in the rest of the world and where we potentially are in 2024 for renewables and wind. What do you see, obviously, with the other elections going on, as the opportunity in other countries that the UK is going to have to compete with?
I mean, if you sort of look at sort of the top trumps here and the strengths and weaknesses, I would say, look, the UK is a really attractive destination again. After, I mean, it wasn't in September last year after the last auction, which many know didn't go according to plan. The general sentiment around the UK investment environment for delivering renewable energy projects is pretty solid as we go into 2024. However, as a destination for investment in building the industries around that, there are other countries or other places which have done well. I mean, much has been said about the US Inflation Reduction Act. I personally think we need to pay more attention in the UK to the wind power package, which was announced in Europe, together with the European Net Zero Industries Act, which are policies which are clearly designed to stimulate investment in factory capacity. There's one statistic in that global capacity for wind turbine manufacture may be at full capacity by 2026. That's not terribly far away. And building new factories takes time, but that's also a glorious opportunity for countries like the UK to make sure that they're an attractive destination. We've got the right packages around support for investment, skills development, for dealing with sort of some of the thorny issues that we have, like industrial energy prices, and trying to put packages of support to make sure that we get the right foreign direct investment. But coupled, and again, the Mission Zero report was very strong on the whole point around comparative advantage. We and as a sector are working really hard on unlocking this with what we call our industrial growth plan, identifying the real pockets of UK capability, which can, rather than work out how you take your share of the supply chain, how you work out what's your proposition into that international landscape. And I'll give you an example. Sort of logically, the UK, due to its aerospace capability, is excellent at aerodynamics and composite materials. What do we make wind turbine blades out of? Composite materials, and you need to be pretty smart at aerodynamics. And we could really lead some of the innovation in that space in the future by bringing some of that latent existing capability and applying it to the grand challenges that we have in these emerging sectors. And these are the sort of the smart, intelligent conversations we're having about unlocking research and development capital and targeting that towards areas where we can put some sensible bets on the UK.
Brilliant. Well, Dan, thanks very much for the opportunity for me to ask you questions. Often they get the chance.